Hi, I'm Julie Kratz. I am a TEDx speaker and inclusive leadership developer. I have authored books about workplace inclusion, like Lead Like an Ally. And today on the show, we unpack unconscious bias, how to handle pesky microaggressions that happen in the workplace, and talk about what it's like to be a white woman leading diversity work in corporate America.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Hey, would you do me a favor? Send me a note, send me a DM on one of the 4 big social media outlets and tell us what platform you listen to us on. Is it Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, however you listen? Tell us where it is. Tell us your favorite episode. And I'm going to pick a winner of everybody who writes to me and going to offer a prize of worth about $1,500. And that's an underestimate. It'll probably be quite transformational for you if you win it. So write to us on one of the DM me on one of the platforms. Let us know where you're listening and what's your favorite podcast. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know and for joining us today. Now, let me ask you, what do you need to do to up-level your leadership? Look, we all know the truth. Some leaders are just, they're dickish. However, most leaders are not. And some come across as being dickish in that category, not because they are, but because they want to be inclusive leaders of diverse teams, but they struggle about how to even ask the right questions. So to up-level your leadership, how about discovering and applying into your culture thoughtful questions about diversity? Well, stay tuned because that's where we're going on today's show. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything by transforming meaning into action. Curious to know more? Simply go to dovbaron.com. That's DOVBARON.com. And this episode of Leadership and Loyalty is brought to you in part by our other podcast, Curiosity Bites. Curiosity Bites is the answer to your question, how do we bring people together who completely disagree? This is exactly what your heart, your mind, your soul has been craving. It's your chance to sit in on some very real conversations with some of the world's most interesting people. We are talking about Grammy Award-winning entertainers. We're talking about entrepreneurs, skeptics, quantum physicists, holy people, philosophers, neuroscientists, neurosurgeons, astronauts. I mean, just amazing people. Some of whom you might think you'd really disagree with, who you discover are truly fascinating. Simply go to dovbaron.com and find out how you can sink your teeth into the delicious Curiosity Bites. We always need your help in staying relevant, so please get over to wherever you tune into the show. Do us a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and share it with everybody you know. If you are a regular listener, a big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners. And we are honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. All right, let's strip it down, dive right in. Here's one of the things I know for sure about human beings. Human beings will let each other get away with all kinds of stuff that we shouldn't. However, there is one thing I'm pretty certain that universally is unacceptable, and that is looking stupid. We all have egos, and no one wants to look stupid or feel that someone else has made us look stupid. So here's the challenge. When times, cultures, awarenesses change, as they will inevitably do, there is going to be certain things that we may know very little about, or maybe you're not even thought about, that suddenly become very important. If we don't fully understand these things as they've become front and center for us, there's a good chance that we could look stupid. Again, unacceptable. With that comes the danger that we'll either run away or most likely we'll pretend to understand and end up causing a bloody big mess. This is often the case with diversity, inclusion, and allyship. These are all hot subjects of our time. But what do they really mean? And how can we address them with our teams, in a thoughtful and empowering way? Well, let's find out together, because our guest today is Julie Kratz. Now, Julie holds an MBA from Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. She is a certified master coach and is a certified unconscious bias trainer. Her books include Pivot Point, How to Build a Winning Career Game Plan, One, How Male Allies Support Women for Gender Equality, and her latest book, which has the foreword written by two of our favorite guests, the good guys themselves. That's Dr. Brad Johnson and Dr. David Smith. Julie's latest book is called Lead Like an Ally. It's a journey through corporate America with strategies that facilitate inclusion. Julie develops inclusive workshops, inclusive workplace cultures through allyship across gender, race, and all dimensions of diversity. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and help me to welcome TEDx speaker, inclusive leadership trainer, executive coach, author, and founder of Next Pivot Point, Julie Kratz.
Thanks so much for having me. What a wonderful introduction.
It feels a bit WWF, but it's fun.
It's very inclusive.
It is. Thank you. So in the context of leadership, the first question I always like to ask is, in the context of leadership development, I find in my work, a lot of time people are asking the wrong questions, so they get the wrong answers. So in the context of leadership development, what is the question that you believe we should be looking for answers to, but we're not?
Such an important question. I think a lot of times leaders, like you said, well-intentioned, make mistakes. I call it the bumble and stumble along the way, where you say or do something that's not so good. And I think what they're thinking is, hey, I want to be inclusive. Like, of course, I want to be inclusive. I want my team to respect me. I want to have a good, healthy workplace culture. But how do I show that I'm committed? And I think that's the big daunting question that a lot of leaders in corporate settings are asking right now. Hey, I may not consider myself to be quote unquote diverse, which I would argue we all have some diversity to bring, but I'm not sure how to step into this conversation in a way that's going to land well. And so what I usually do, like you said, my fear and my ego rule that. And instead I choose not to say anything, which is worse than saying something that's maybe not perfect. So it's just, how do I show up? How do I show my commitment without faltering on that ego?
You know, that's so important. And it's going to, of course, it opens a whole can of worms that we need to explore. So let's start right at the beginning. Let's jump in and clarify by removing anything that has potential to make any leader or any of our listeners feel stupid. So if you can, in a brief way, one by one, what is diversity? What is inclusion? What is allyship? Because for the person who doesn't know that, aren't they all the same?
Right. And the words have gotten lumped together. I think a lot of the language has been created from an academic standpoint. And so it doesn't always land well in a corporate setting. And the origins of this is back to legal things with equal opportunity employment and affirmative action. So I think there's a lot of confusion about the state of DEI in 2021.
Right.
So simply put, the D in the acronym is for diversity. And that really just means diversity of perspective, diversity of background. It's representation. So a lot of people liken that to race and gender, but there's way more dimensions of diversity that we can speak to. Inclusion, the I, is not only do we have diverse representation, but people feel included, meaning they feel a sense of belonging in the workplace. They feel seen, they feel heard. They're not just invited to the meeting, but they're listened to when they speak at that meeting. That's what true inclusion is. And the E is sandwiched in the middle that more commonly you're starting to see in titles of corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion officers. That E is for equity. And it really means that we approach people and meet them where they're at and provide the level of support that people need based on their lived experiences and circumstances, which is different than equality. Equality is like, yeah, let's treat everybody equally and hope we get something different.
Right.
Equity is like, no, we need to treat people differently if we want different outcomes. And then the last one you threw out there was allyship.
Yeah.
The A is my personal favorite place to speak and to talk about, because it's really being there for somebody that's different than you, providing a level of support and being an active ally, not just sitting on the sidelines and not just
Right.
reading the book, listening to the podcast. It's like, I'm going to do some hard stuff too, and that's what allies do really well.
So let's just touch there for a minute. When you talk about doing some hard stuff as an ally, can you give me an example of what that would look like?
Yeah. And it's really the small, subtle acts of allyship that really have a huge impact. It's, keeping your radar up for non-inclusive behavior. For example, if you go to a meeting where everybody looks the same, behaves the same, acts the same, same background, an ally might look around the room and think, hey, who's not here that should be? Or what
Mm,
perspective are we missing at this table? So that's a simple thing to do as an ally, is just to watch out and to make sure that we're truly being inclusive and that different perspectives are being invited. Another thing that allies can look out for are what I call microaggressions. So these are just the subtle little signals that you don't belong. This happens a lot more commonly to women, to people of color, those with disabilities, those in the LGBTQ plus community, for example. And it's just this like icky little thing that happened. It's kind of like a mosquito bite. You get one and it's like, oh, that itches, but you get 20 of them and you got a whole different problem. The
right.
cumulative effect of microaggressions is the same thing. It's an interruption. It's not being invited to the meeting. It's maybe somebody making an assumption about you based on your skin color, based on your gender identity, without even really knowing you. And so those little subtle things a lot of times lead to a comprehensive negative experience in the
Hmm.
workplace that, a lot of times people opt out. I'm like, I'm not going to stay somewhere where I'm being microaggressed on a regular basis. But that's what an ally can do, is say, hey, she was still talking. Let's continue the conversation. Or, hey, she shared that idea earlier. Let's go back to her. Those little affirmations that you can plop into a conversation can really redirect the whole narrative of what it's like for someone to be in the workplace that's different.
Well, we spoke earlier about ego, but and that is part of what I want to push back on, because you've got ego there, and part of ego is people think about ego as, I'm all that and I'm a bag of chips. But ego is also the protective mechanism inside of us. It's the part of us that doesn't want us to be wrong. And it's also the part of us that sees things as being fearful. And when I had Brad and David on, the good guys, who wrote the foreword for your book, one of the things that we talked about was, you know, those people who are silent when things happen. Uh, um, and the answer to that is, of course, hey, I really am supportive of this gay person, or this person of color, or this person who is a female, or this person who is whatever, that's outside of the old white male who went to a particular school. But at the same time, I'm not going to speak up because my job would be on the line. My position might get, the boss might might not take it well from me, or I consider myself shy and I wouldn't normally speak up anyway. So I'm not speaking up because they're gay. I'm not speaking up because there's a microaggression. I just don't speak up. So
Mm.
there's all these pushback excuses, right? So walk us through some of how to deal with that, because that's real for people, right?
Oh,
It's like,
yeah.
yeah, I really want to support you, but I got to pay the rent.
Yeah. My job's on the line, or my
Right.
reputation. And I think sometimes people overestimate the impact to come back on them. What I know about this work is when you lean into it and you say something when things are uncomfortable and you choose to say something, that impact is huge on that person at the time. And it's very unlikely that there's going to be repercussions back to you. Now, of course, you want to handle this in a skillful way, much like you talk about on your podcast. Being respectful and appropriate when I say call someone in. if you see something, say something. If you don't say something, it's the equivalent of letting it happen again, or
Hmm.
it's saying, hey, this is acceptable behavior here, especially if you're a leader. You're modeling every day what you expect from other people. And so I would argue part of the duty of being a leader, especially if you're leading people, is setting that model, setting that blueprint for others to follow. So, yeah, sitting on the sidelines, not saying something when someone makes an inappropriate comment or joke, that I would push back and say that's not what a leader does. And if that is okay behavior at your organization culturally, then you probably got some work to do with your culture.
But again, it's the person who maybe doesn't have that major level of authority. I'm totally agree with you as a leader, as the person who is the big boss or whatever that term might be. Um, if you are not modeling the behavior you want, you can expect a terrible culture. But in the context of being a senior VP or even a manager, you're always looking up that chain, right? And so that's where that fear will often put a stranglehold on the vocal cords and say, yeah, don't say anything. And
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. I think that it takes a courageous environment, a courageous individual. But I think there's a deeper values question. The values question is, yeah, I got to feed the kids, I got to pay the rent, but where's my values?
Mm-hmm.
Where are my values? If that was my kid, or that was my nephew or niece, or if that was my whatever, would I? And if the answer is yeah, then that's the place you got to step up into. It
Mm-hmm.
is challenging though. There's no doubt about it.
Well, and I think it's challenging because people don't have the scripts, right? They don't have the go-to language to use. And that's very commonly where people come in this conversation. Hey, I was in this meeting, so and so did this. I didn't know what to do, so I just didn't do anything. Now it's too late. What do I say? And I would just offer in those moments when you feel like cringy feeling and no one says anything and you're afraid, just a simple clarifying question of, hey, when you said that, what'd you mean? Help
Mhm.
me understand where you're coming from on this. My perspective's this. I get the sense you think about it differently. Let's talk about it. And
Right.
the last thing I'd say too, it doesn't have to be in the moment. With feedback and tough conversations, it's okay to sleep on it and to reset in the morning and say, hey, let's take 5 and unpack how that went yesterday.
Hmm.
And one on one, that conversation is usually going to be much better received than publicly. The shame that comes in a public conversation really can create quite defensiveness and make the situation worse. So I do
Yeah.
think there is some part of this protecting our ego that's very real, but practice trying on some language, practice perspective taking of what would it be like if you had a different perspective, or assuming this person had a good perspective and they're saying that, what might that be? And then those help me understand, say more, what is your perspective, elaborate on this come easier out of our mouth if we're in that mindset.
Well, you said something earlier, which I know is your specialty, that people often don't know what to say. They just don't know. And I know that you lay out these beautiful scripts to help people so they're not bloody stumbling over what to say and dancing around egos and all the rest of it. There's actually a really good way to say many of these things. Can you give us some? I mean, you just gave us one, but give us some more of some of the guidelines for people who are like, God, every time I'm in a meeting with my boss, it's cringeworthy. Now what?
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I mean, one phrase I really like, because people generally want to be helpful to one another.
Mhm.
So one of my go-to ally phrases is, "Hey, I want to share something with you, and this might be hard, but I really want to be helpful." Or, "Hey, I could use your help with something," because everyone wants to help you. And then, "I noticed this in this meeting, or I noticed that you said this, and here was my take on it." That helpful play. And you have to, of course, be genuine and authentic when you say
Of
that.
course.
But most people want to be helpful. Most people want to jump in and accept someone's help if you're coming from a good place. And I always just like to take the emotion out of it right away, because
Mm.
as a conflict avoidant person that's somewhat of a people pleaser, this is my hardest part of being an ally myself, is putting on that challenger hat and telling people sometimes things that are unpleasant of, hey, I see this. Do you see it? And I just remind myself in those situations, stay curious, right? Just like you have in your background there. Stay curious, assume positive intent of the individual, and then also assume that they don't know what you know, that they don't see what you see. So they're not, to use your word, trying to be dickish, right?
No.
Like most people don't want to be that. Most of them have good intentions, but their behavior is just falling off, right? And so isolating the behavior is also really a hallmark of having a good conversation, a productive conversation where it's not about you being a jerk. It's more about what you said, what you did was problematic, and associating those behaviors and just unpacking that with somebody of like, what would a better response look like next time? Asking those open-ended questions. People usually get the self-discovery kicks in and they start to solve their own problem versus you having to tell them what to do to make it better.
Well, there's another piece in there, which is, again, leveraging the ego of that person, as you said, which is, I need help. Because now that person, that elevates the other person to a better position and they don't feel criticized by that. I need help. I'm trying to understand this, right? The person, now, and the truth of the matter is, if you have somebody who's very egoic, and let's face it, we've all had those moments, they may be defensive with you. And I want to sort of make you aware of that. They may be defensive with you, but you have without doubt planted a seed. And if that person is not a complete psychopath, that seed will grow and they'll come back in next meeting and they may never admit to you that they were being, racist or biased or whatever it is in any way, shape, or form, but you will start noticing those changes in behavior. And so that's the other thing about it is, just because you don't get the response you want in the moment, don't forget that you've likely planted a seed. And if you've ever planted a seed and then you take it out 1 second later and go, why hasn't it grown? That's kind of foolish. You got to give it a minute. You got to give it time to get some roots and to pop up above the earth. And I think that oftentimes that's what's happening with people. They just need a little bit of time to let it soak in and go, oh, Jesus. Because they're probably cringing just as much as you are, but later. Like I remember years ago when I went through a big transformation on my own work, and a girlfriend, we were living together and we'd had some friends over, and my girlfriend said to me, Jody's not going to come over anymore. I was like, why not? She's so much fun. I really like her. And she goes, because you were a dick to her. I'm like, what? That's ridiculous. I was having fun with her. We were laughing together. She goes, no, you were really rude to her. And I go, that's your opinion. She's got a great sense of humor, right? Totally defensive. She's got a great sense of humor. I saw her laughing. That's ridiculous. I couldn't sleep for 2 full nights and felt so bad that I could have hurt this person, but it was my girlfriend's opinion. I could have hurt her. So what was the only thing to do? I had to confront this person and say to them, listen, my girlfriend told me that I really hurt your feelings. I didn't want to do that. I thought we were being playful. And she goes, yeah, you're funny. You're really funny. And I find you funny, but sometimes I'm the butt of your jokes and it isn't funny. She goes, and that really hurt my feelings. And I was like, oh my God, I never intended that. Right then, I felt shut down. I felt like I had to bite my tongue. I felt like I couldn't speak out. All my ego protective mechanism kicked in. But I decided, okay, what's this about? And went and did some work and went, oh my God, I turned her into this person from history. And I had to do that. And that level of self-awareness, I'm not saying this to say, ooh, look at me, how much I've grown. I'm saying this to say, not, as you said very well, Julie, not everybody has the same level of awareness of you. Mm-mm. Most people are being dickish and they don't know they're being dickish. And that they'll go home and maybe like I did, have a weep into the pillow a couple of nights and feel bad about it. But that will be the catalyst for changing the behavior. And it's you who can be courageous enough to do that. And shaming, as Julie pointed out, is not going to work most of the time. But a private conversation, most of the time, will plant the seed.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Well, the two things you highlighted really well in that story. One, self-awareness. It's a journey. There's no
Yeah,
destination.
faux show.
You can think you've arrived. And I always joke is like, I'm like the perfect ally. No, like I never get to say I'm an ally or I never get to say I've arrived. I always have more work to do, which is the best part and the worst part of this work. And then the second thing, behavior change takes time. And so, like you
Mhm.
said, like a seed being planted, I mean, it takes, and especially for a behavior that's pretty well baked in our brains and that hard wiring has just been reinforced over time, undoing behavior and relearning new behavior, our brains don't like to do that. So just acknowledging that mental energy that it's going to take to shift behavior, it's going to take time. Anyone
Yeah.
that's tried to get healthy, you know what it's like when you shift your diet and exercise and you want to go right back to the old habits. I know I do, even though I know better. This is not about knowing right or wrong or knowing how to be better. This is much more about choosing to be intentional, choosing to be consistent, and really to accept that I'm leading from where I'm at, right? I have influence every day by the behavior I have, and I'm going to take ownership of that.
Solid. Absolutely solid. We're coming already coming towards the end of part one of this 2-part interview. And on the next part, Julie, I want to talk about more of this, particularly in the context of unconscious bias, because you talked about awareness, unconscious bias, because the problem with unconscious bias is, guess what? It's unconscious. So let's talk about unconscious bias, how to recognize unconscious bias, how to recognize when we're sort of pushing it into the way we're seeing things, and how to have those conversations with our team. So not like we were talking about dealing with the situation, but how to start the conversations with the teams so that we are more inclusive, so that we are less biased, so we are greater allies for each member of our team. Before we go, though, I want to make sure that everybody can, make sure that they find out about you, what it is you do, your fabulous books. So would you mind telling everybody where they can find out more about you, please?
Oh, please. Yeah. So I post daily on LinkedIn for your resources, tools, information. So be sure to check me out there, Julie Kratz, Kratz. And then nextpivotpoint.com has some wonderful resources like a diversity dictionary you can download with all the terms we've been talking about in today's episode, as well as books, podcasts, other information.
Diversity dictionary.
Yes, the top 20 terms. You asked me
back to that one. That will be good. All right.
Yep.
So stay with us. We're going to come back in just one click for this delicious conversation with Julie Kratz. So stay curious, my friends. Stay curious. We'll see you in one click.